Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian Kuhn, Director of the Florida Division of Emergency Management, NEMA past President. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar entitled Using Economic Impact Modeling for Disaster Preparedness, Resilience, and Recovery. And I got to tell you, I'm very excited about this topic. We started doing a couple of pilots with this in Florida during Hurricane Matthew with regards to power outages and some of the restoration efforts, so I'm excited to learn more about the subject today. Our presenter today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Lloyd Blanchard. Dr. Blanchard is an economist who uses economic modeling tools such as M-Plan and the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis RIMS-2 multipliers to support the catastrophic planning work done for regional, state, and municipal jurisdictions. He uses these tools to estimate the economic impacts of the drilling moratorium on various industries that rely on access to the Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010, the economic benefits that would derive from resiliency investment of HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition for a municipal client, and currently supports catastrophic planning for Washington, D.C. by estimating the economic impacts of various disaster scenarios likely to befall the district. Lloyd, thank you very much for being with us today, and I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, this slide shows an overview of today's webinar. First, I'll summarize the different uses of economic impact estimates for the various disaster management phases. Then I'll dive into the main concepts of economic impact analysis. After we get a handle on these concepts, I'll show you how to apply them to model the economic disaster impacts. Here, I'll discuss the work I did for two IEM contracts as case studies. First, the Washington, D.C. emergency planning scenarios, and then the impact for a disaster at the Los Angeles International Airport. After presenting these case studies, I'll show you where you can find the disaster and economic data to conduct this kind of analysis. And finally, we will walk through the basic steps to forecast economic impacts of a disaster, including a review of the calculations for a hypothetical example. All of you are familiar with the disaster management cycle. With the exception of the response phase, economics methodologies can be used to guide any one or another economic or disaster management phase. The mitigation phase relies strongly on benefit-cost analyses to justify mitigation investments. Economic impact analysis can be used to estimate the resiliency benefits associated with alternative mitigation strategies. For example, HUD's National Disaster Resilience Competition encourages grant recipients to design resiliency projects that deliver benefits beyond the resiliency benefit. For example, a flood control project could integrate multiple community reclamation ponds with riverines that included economic development features like the San Antonio's Riverwalk, or features like walking and biking paths. Economic impact analysis can estimate these additional benefits. For disaster preparedness, economic impact analysis can be used to support catastrophic planning for various disaster scenarios, and it can be used to estimate benefits of continued business operations, or it could be used to support budget planning. Later in this webinar, I will discuss how I applied economic impact analysis to catastrophic planning. For recovery purposes, economic impact analysis can be used to estimate the downstream economic effects of community losses after a disaster, which can help justify federal recovery grant requests. Refer to the changes in economic activity as a result of a disaster. When disasters strike, roads get blocked, businesses and residential properties take on damages, and schools and businesses close. These immediate impacts in a particular location also have secondary economic impacts. When we conduct an economic impact analysis, we seek estimates of three types of economic effects. First, direct effects are the immediate costs from a disaster event. As the picture shows, these are the on-site effects. Second, indirect effects are the secondary effects associated with reduced business activity. When one business is hit by a storm and is forced to close for some period, this is a direct effect. When that business reduces its purchases of supplies due to the closure, this is an indirect effect. One can think of indirect effects as offside effects. A supplier may not have been hit by the storm, but it will be affected because its customer was hit by the storm. Third, induced effects are also secondary effects, but those associated with changes in the behavior of households. Households both as workers and as customers of businesses. When the business that was hit by the storm has to close down, workers are not able to work and thus earn less pay and spend less money. This is the downstream effect, and it feeds back into further indirect effects. Now, metaphorically, one way to think about these effects is to imagine tossing a rock into a pond. The immediate splash is the direct effect, and the concentric ripples throughout the pond represent the indirect effects. Now, at some point, these ripples will reach the shore of the pond and ripple back toward the center of the immediate impact. These can be thought of as the induced effects. On this slide, the picture shows how money circulates in an economy. Those of you who have ever taken an economics class in college likely saw a picture like this on the first day of class, just before you decided to drop that course. Businesses buy supplies from suppliers, households work for these businesses and receive compensation, and then they spend that as income. This spending circulates through an economy, whether local, regional, or national, allowing businesses to grow, spend more on supplies, and hire more employees. This economic cycle continues until it is interrupted by some external force. These external forces can be things like the bursting of an economic bubble, like the housing market crash we experienced in 2007 and 2008, or like the infusion of cash, like the $800 billion stimulus package passed by Congress in response to the housing market crash. The economic impact of these external forces can be positive or negative, and the impact can be estimated using economic impact multipliers. The multipliers measure how much a given dollar circulates through an economy. When a dollar is added to the economy, some portion of it gets spent again and again and again, creating positive economic impacts beyond the initial expenditure. The opposite is true when a dollar is taken out of the economy. That dollar no longer circulates, so negative economic impacts ensue. The multipliers most commonly used are created by the regional input-output modeling system of the Bureau of Economic Analysis at the Department of Commerce. The input-output models are better known as I/O models, and they capture how much various industries buy from one another. The more industries buy from other industries, the larger the multiplier. With this slide, we now turn to modeling the effects of a disaster on a local or regional economy. Clearly, different types of disasters have different effects on communities and their ability to keep schools and business operations open. The key to modeling the economic impacts of a disaster is to first model the disaster itself. Now, by this, I don't mean that you have to create hurricane storm tracks or geological seismic models, but you do have to understand how different types of disasters of varying levels of severity can impact basic economic activity at the local or regional level. You also have to think about what economic activity will be affected in your community and where, which precise location in that community. This is the most important step to conducting an economic impact analysis of a disaster because it requires the most thought. You have to think through how a flood or a storm or an earthquake will impact your particular community and the industries associated in your community. The multipliers are the easiest part as they only require simple multiplication. Many of you are familiar with HAZUS, which has the data embedded to model various kinds of disasters of varying levels of severity. If you have the capability to run disaster scenarios on HAZAS, use it first, and then take key outputs from HAZAS and multiply those outputs by the relevant multipliers. The relevant HAZAS outputs are property damage and business interruption estimates. I'll return to this in a moment. This slide shows the generalized process that you would follow to model the economic impacts of a disaster. If you cannot use HAZAS, you might model your disaster by going through this slide and answering these questions for your scenario. What type of disaster is it? What's the size of the disaster? Where will it strike? Which industry sectors will be affected? And what's the annual production of those industry sectors? How many days are business activities interrupted if they are interrupted? How many people are injured? How many people are killed? And what is the value of the property damage? And what is the value of the business interruption? Ultimately, you will need to arrive at overall values of property damage and the overall value of the business interruption. You will add these two together to determine the direct effect of the disaster. And of course, HAZAS produces these numbers, but you would have to arrive at these in some way or other if you do not have HAZAS. Now, as the final question, I've added the value of statistical life, VSL, here as a direct impact because it has economic value. However, I do not include these in my economic impact analysis. I do this because the multipliers that we use in the analysis mainly model business behavior, and the VSL requires the modeling of the behavior of households. And this is just an additional complication I tend not to use in my analyses of disaster impacts. So the previous slide focused on modeling the disaster itself. This slide shows you the three basic steps to get from the direct effects from the disaster to the total economic impacts. First, you take the sum of the value of property damage and business interruption to get at the direct effects. And then you allocate these effects by location and industry. The hardest part of your analysis will be determining what industries will be affected in your community and precisely where in that community. This process requires some logic and, if you have access to it, some historical evidence in that community. 2, take the direct effects for each location and multiply them by the economic impact multipliers to get the total economic impacts for that location. Then add up the locational impacts for a total economic impact for the whole economy for your community, whether a local economy or a regional economy or a state economy. Third, to estimate the indirect effects, simply subtract the direct effects from the total economic impacts. Let's say your multiplier is equal to 1.5. The 1 in that number is the direct effect. The 0.5 in that number is the sum of the indirect and the induced effects. If you're absolutely determined to include the value of statistical life in your analysis, I would recommend that you add this at the end of your total economic impacts estimate. Do not multiply VSL by the multipliers because your multipliers are associated with business behavior and not the value of individual and life. So these are the case studies that I'll discuss now. I've applied economic impact analysis for catastrophic planning for 2 IEM contracts. First, the Washington, D.C. emergency planning scenario contract, and then we had worked with the Los Angeles International Airport to estimate the economic impacts from a major earthquake. With the Washington, D.C. planning scenarios, we were charged with estimating the economic impacts from various types of disaster scenarios. terrorist attack scenarios, earthquake scenarios, and other kinds of chemical spill scenarios. The terrorist attack, as you might imagine, would have an impact in a particular location. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., it could take place in the northeast, northwest, southeast, or southwest part of town. And more particularly, it could happen in any one or another of the 8 or 10 wards that exist in Washington, D.C. Different industries, of course, exist in different wards. The professional services industry, as we know in D.C., exists downtown, while other industries, more traditional industries, exist in all of the other wards. For this particular planning scenario contract, we used HAZUS to model the disasters, and then I used the outputs on property damage and business interruption, added those up, multiplied them by the multipliers to get at the secondary effects for each of the different wards in the district. And then I added those effects up ward by ward to get at the total economic impact for Washington, D.C. as a whole. Now, in the next slide, don't go to the next slide yet, but later on we'll talk about how we get those data, both for the Washington, D.C. economy or your given regional economy and the multipliers. For the next case study, we'll talk about the contract to estimate impacts of an earthquake on LAX. The earthquake scenario that we were given was a pretty significant scenario. It was a pretty significant earthquake, 7.2 on the Richter scale. This is a fairly large earthquake that had a center very near the airport. Since the estimated impacts started with the airport, we had to model the impact using data on the business activity at and around the airport, and then use regional economic multipliers for the city as a whole, for Los Angeles, actually not just the city, but the MSA, to estimate the secondary economic impacts. So we started by looking at the business activity of the airport. We determined how the earthquake would reduce that business activity, both at the airport and around the airport. And by around the airport, I mean the parking lots associated with the airport, the business activity, taxis and otherwise, very closely linked to the airport, that would be directly affected if an earthquake were to take out sections of the airport itself. Not to mention, of course, the flight, the changes in flight behavior or reductions in flight that would bring people, visitors and all, to the Los Angeles area. We modeled all of this activity to come up with a direct effect both on property and on the business interruption, and then we took the sum of the property damage and business interruption and multiplied it by the multipliers to get at the secondary effects that would ripple throughout the Los Angeles metropolitan area. Fortunately, well, in this particular contract, we didn't have the benefit of using HAZUS, so we could not model the earthquake using HAZUS. But fortunately, almost all major airports have already conducted economic impact analyses on the surrounding economy. So we took advantage of these studies to help us model the economic activity in and around the airport. And then, of course, we assumed that, we measured a drop in that airport activity and then went on to estimate the secondary effects from that decrease in airport activity. So whether for the Washington case scenario or the airport case scenario, typically when we model the disaster itself, we want to try to get some kind of historical data on disasters that would help us understand how disasters of varying levels of severity create varying types of impacts, whether those impacts are on property damages, whether those impacts are in the form of lives. These disaster data locations can provide that information. The one that I use most often is the Hazard and Vulnerability Research Institute data at the University of South Carolina. Many of you know that this institute is run by Dr. Susan Cutter. These data you will have to purchase by geographic expanse, but it's relatively inexpensive. Other data that's freely available, and it covers the entire world, is the IMDAT data set, or the International Disaster Database at the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. This is in Brussels, and it has disaster data, including property damages, lives affected, etc. All disasters around the world, all significant disasters around the world. Many of you are already familiar with the information that's provided at the FEMA website, where FEMA lists its disaster declarations. This allows you to get at more detailed data on qualitative effects of the disasters. And there may be some quantitative indicators in there from individual assistance and public assistance programs. That provides the disaster data. I mean, these sites will help you gather information on the disaster itself to understand the impacts that they create. For the economic data, there are many different sources that you might use. The Federal Reserve tends to have decent data, but the data that I would recommend you use is the economic data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. This BEA is located at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and this is the data that BEA uses to create their multipliers. So it makes sense that you would use the regional data that's consistent with the construction of the regional multipliers. So let's walk through the methodology of estimating or forecasting disaster impacts. First, as I said earlier, you want to allocate the direct output impacts to the industries and to the locations. We've already talked about how to model the disaster itself, and if you can use HAZUS, you want to use it. If you can't, then you want to follow those steps that we outlined previously. Second is to compute the total impacts using the final demand multipliers. On the next slide, I'll show you what those multipliers look like, and I'll make a distinction between final demand multipliers and direct impact multipliers. The third step is to compute the direct impacts for earnings and employment using direct effect multipliers. I don't mention the economic output here because we determined that in the first step. That comes from property damage and business interruption effects. And finally, we compute the indirect and the induced impacts by subtracting the direct impacts from the total impacts. So what we'll do, next slide please, what we'll do now is talk about these multipliers in greater detail. So there are two types of multipliers that you would use to multiply changes to. So the final demand multipliers and the direct effect multipliers. The final demand multipliers measure the change in output, earnings, and employment in all industries as a result of a dollar change in a given industry's output. In other words, if a given industry faced a certain amount of damage or a certain amount of business interruption, then the final demand multipliers would be multiplied by that industry's output change to capture the effects on outputs across all industries, earnings across all industries, and employment across all industries. So look at the industries. I have this is at the bottom chart, this is of the multiplier table. There are many industries, but I've just shown you the first 6. So if the crop and animal production industry faced a $1 million disaster impact, I would multiply that $1 million by 1.6783 to understand what the impact would be on all other industries. What the total impact would be, but the 0.6783 piece really captures that extended impact on all other industries because the crop and animal production industry purchases from those industries. And then you see the multipliers for the associated earnings that employees make and the jobs that would be affected. The direct effect multipliers are multipliers used when you have information, not in terms of changes in industry output, but information in terms of changes in jobs and changes in earnings. So depending upon what information you are given will depend upon which multiplier you use, but normally you will start with determining what the property damage is and the business interruption change is, and use the final demand multipliers to get at total impacts, and then use the direct effect multipliers to get at the direct impacts on earnings and employment. We'll illustrate that when we go through these example slides next. These results will derive from applying the forecast methodology we've just discussed to a disaster that imposes a $10 million direct impact on a community. And we're saying here that this hypothetical community has only two industries, oil and gas and utilities. These results, well, I've sort of repeated this, didn't I? So I apologize for that. So let's look at the table. Normally, this is how we'll report total economic impacts. The first column, of course, shows the industries and the various parts of that industry. Output is the economic output or revenue in that industry. Earnings is the earnings of the employees in that industry. And employment is the employment of the employees in that industry. Same thing is true for the utilities. Now, when we express direct impacts or primary impacts as shown here, that is the impact on the industry itself. When we refer to total impacts, which adds secondary impacts to the primary impacts, that secondary impacts addresses all of the impacts that extends throughout the economy, beyond the oil and gas industry, beyond the utilities industry, so that the total impacts captures all economic impacts from the disaster across the entire economy. Well, the next slide simply shows you something you may have seen before if you're interested in dealing with the statistical value of life. This slide simply shows that, I believe this slide has been used by FEMA, but somebody may challenge me on that. I think because that has changed recently, or it's different by federal agency. But this slide simply shows that a life is worth $6.6 million. And depending upon the type of, the severity of the industry impacted, it will implicate some fraction of that $6.6 million. So the fraction of the VSL multiplied by the $6.6 million produces the economic value of that type of industry, injury. This gets to be pretty complicated when you add it to an economic impact analysis, so I rarely do it, but it is possible to include. So let's walk through that hypothetical example, the calculations for that hypothetical example of a city that has two industries and faced a $10 million worth of damages and business interruption. So step one is to allocate our direct output impacts. So here we're saying of the $10 million, of the $10 million direct impact, 75% of that will impact the oil and gas industry, and 25% of that will impact the utilities industry, creating $7.5 million impact on the oil and gas and $2.5 million impact on utilities. These are the direct effects by industry. The second step would be to compute the total economic impacts. Now what we're doing is taking the impact by industry, the direct impact by industry, and multiplying it by the relevant multiplier. For oil and gas, to get the economic output impact, we take the $7.5 million and multiply it by 1.4358, and you'll see it on the chart where I've circled it on the oil and gas line. You do the same for the $2.5 million direct impact on utilities, but using the utility multiplier for outputs, the final demand multiplier for outputs. And you see that circled down on the bottom line. That creates a 10.7 point, well, you can see the results. So now we want to estimate the earnings impact associated with this $7.5 million impact on oil and gas and $2.5 million impact on utilities. We take those, the direct dollar impact, and multiply it by the final demand earnings multiplier, which is 0.2308 for oil and gas and 0.1856 for utilities. If we want to estimate the impact on employment for the $10 million direct impact on employment, we would take that oil and gas number, 7.5 million, multiply it by the final demand employment multiplier, and that is 3.7132 for oil and gas, and 3.7163 for utilities. That creates an estimated number of jobs that were impacted, and I just add them up by, across industries to get at a total impact number. So this slide shows the total economic impacts in terms of outputs, in terms of economic output. That total impact is $14.2 million. The total earnings that were impacted, which is almost $2 million, and 37 jobs across the entire economy. So step 3 is simply to subtract out, is to get at the direct impacts. Well, the direct impact we've already gotten in the very first step of 7.5 million and for oil and gas and 2.5 million for utilities. But to get at the direct impact for earnings and employment, which is to say, to get at the impact that falls on one industry or another, because the total impacts captures the whole economy, you simply take the estimate that you got in the previous step and divide by the relevant direct effect multiplier. So let's look at the total earnings impact for oil and gas. We took the $7.5 million direct, multiplied it by the multiplier to get a $1.731 million oil and gas earnings impact. To get the share of that $1.731 million oil and gas impact on oil and gas earnings itself, we divide by 1.612. So this says that $1,073,821 of earnings falls only on oil and gas employees, while $1.731 million of earnings falls on all employees throughout the economy. We do the same for utilities. We do the same analogously for the employment impacts. So on the previous slide, we estimated 27.8 jobs would be impacted throughout the economy in oil and gas. We would divide by the relevant direct effect multiplier to get at the 7 jobs in oil and gas alone. So that suggests that 7 jobs would be impacted in oil and gas. 20 jobs would be impacted throughout the economy from the oil and gas impact. For utilities, 3 jobs would be impacted in utilities, and the difference is 6.3 jobs would be impacted throughout the economy from the utilities impact. All I've done in that last calculation is to subtract out the direct effects from the total effects to get at the indirect effects, which are shown here. We do it this way because the multipliers are all-inclusive direct, indirect, and induced effects. If you want only indirect effects, you have to use type 1 multipliers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Indirect effects capture the business effects. If you want the indirect and induced effects, you want to use type 2 multipliers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So that's pretty much all I have for this presentation. At this point, we'll turn the presentation back over to our moderator, Brian Kuhn, for your questions. Brian?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Blanchard. I appreciate all of that. So this is very interesting. Obviously, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for us to use this on the planning side as we try to understand how best to allocate our resources for that. What you have described is probably not something that most emergency managers are going to do themselves. So what is the best way to get this done? Should they go through somebody in their government who already does this, a local academic institution, a private business or contractor who would do this? Who can do this kind of work for an emergency manager?
Well, any economist at a local community college or major university can conduct this kind of analysis. Now, most economists don't do this kind of work, but they have the skills to do it. You know, with careful attention to the slides that we've presented here, it can be done by the average person with, you know, simple multiplication skills. It's the hardest part, as I've mentioned earlier, Brian, is modeling the disaster's impact on your community. If a disaster scenario you're planning for is a terrorist attack on the coastline of your community, well, you're going to look at the businesses and the industries that would be interrupted by some explosion of a bomb, say, along that coastline in that geographic vicinity. That's where you have to get the logic in your thought process in, and you have to make assumptions about which businesses will be hit, how severe will they be hit, and how much will that take them offline in terms of producing business revenue. If you can answer those questions, you can get at a dollar value using the data, using the economic production data we presented on the website slide. You can get at some kind of value of business interruption loss. Certainly, if you have the capability to run a HAZUS scenario, then use HAZUS, take the property damage data, add it to the business interruption data, and you have your direct effect number that would then be used to multiply against the multipliers. So most economists would have this capability from any college, community college or otherwise, but IEM is one consulting firm in the disaster management field that has this capability.
Okay, thank you. How do the clients that you have worked for and others have worked for, how have you seen them utilize this data?
Generally, what they're trying to do, Brian, this is a very good question. Generally, what they're trying to do is inform their bosses on, you know, it's one thing to express disaster impacts in terms of lives, in terms of number of people injured. They want to know, how is this going to ripple through our economy? How is this going to hurt jobs? How is this going to hurt businesses? They want to know what the dollar value of those impacts are, and this is the right tool to use it. Now, we have to make assumptions about disasters that have not yet happened. And so by making those assumptions, you know, we're sort of in this world of estimation, and that's fine. This tool allows you to sort of hone that estimate in a structured fashion instead of just wild guess about the economic impacts. You know, this disaster happened to this community, and it created $10 million worth of property damages. What does that mean for economic damages? I don't know. This tool will help you get at that second question. But with some historical information, with some knowledge about what has happened to similar communities in the past for a given type of disaster, you can get at that sort of initial property damage and business interruption impact. But then this methodology will help you estimate the extended impacts on the entire economy, and those impacts will be expressed in terms of lost revenue throughout the economy, in terms of lost jobs throughout the economy, and in terms of lost earnings throughout the economy. Clearly, these are the kinds of impacts that local elected officials are certainly, interested in, and these kinds of impacts help them think about budget planning requirements and requirements, or at least how much to ask for in terms of federal grant assistance.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, I've got a couple of questions I'm going to try to combine and add in mind, which is there a way to do this kind of thing real time that would allow you to change some variables to see what the outcome is, so that you can determine how to utilize, say you have, for example, one generator and two places that need it. Is there a way you can do this real time to determine which is the better option? And then two other questions that are along the same lines. One is, are there any other readily available tools besides HASIS that can be used to estimate disaster damage? And and next question, is there any commercial software that supports or comes close to completing this type of analyses? So is there a tool that you can use real time to help determine what you should be doing during the response phase?
No, none that I am aware of. Only HASIS is the sort of tool that we have used during response phase to estimate what we might expect to find as we are sort of digging ourselves out of the impacts. We did this some years ago for the state of Louisiana in the Department of Economic, their economics department. I'm forgetting the name of the department, but it was for the state of Louisiana during Hurricanes Gustav and Ike. We were sitting there alongside the secretary. I was doing the economic impact analysis using whatever data I can get my hands on, as described in this presentation, while another of my colleagues, one of the professors at LSU, was calling around the state to get a sense of what businesses were being closed down, what businesses were being were sort of reduced operations, so that we can in effect reconcile truthing data on the ground with the estimates that we were using from this modeling exercise. That's how we did it in real time. But there are no tools available that I'm aware of other than HASIS that model the disaster and the impacts of disasters. In terms of just running economic impacts, there are plenty of tools beyond the multipliers of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. One of those tools is a tool called, or software tool called IMPLAN. IMPLAN is an acronym, IMPLAN. It is developed by a company called MEG. It's fairly sophisticated. The use of that software would require some detailed economic knowledge, because it allows you to specify economic impacts at a very fine level using detailed information on wages, costs associated with various industries. But that tool was not developed for the purpose of estimating disaster impacts, just economic impacts. What we have to do in the disaster management world is determine how much damage and immediate costs and losses does the disaster create. Then we use these economic tools to estimate how those immediate losses and costs ripple through the economy.
Okay, thank you. All right, I've got several questions with regards to the multipliers. I'm just read them all. How did you come up with the multipliers? They're unsure how you develop those multipliers. How do you get those numbers? So can you, if you could again restate exactly how you get the multipliers that you used in the model?
The multipliers that I showed you in the presentation were purchased from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. For each economy, for each regional or local economy or state economy, you can buy multipliers for $275. So for Washington, D.C., we spent $275 to get the multipliers, and then we gathered the free data on the economic production for the industries in the Washington, D.C. economy. Same thing is true for the Los Angeles scenario. We purchased for $275. The multipliers tied to the Los Angeles metropolitan economy, and we use those multipliers to estimate the ripple effects of the damages caused to LAX.
Okay, so if you are an emergency manager who's part of a government agency, is it likely that they have already probably purchased those multipliers for some of the other economic activity that they do, and you can just get it from one of your sister agencies? So me, for example, I could probably go to the state's Department of Economic Opportunity maybe and get those multiplier sets, or would it require us to purchase our own if we decided to do that?
Yeah, if you're part of a jurisdiction that has a Department of Economic Development, they will likely have access to these multipliers already. They will likely have already purchased these multipliers, or they will likely have already gotten some economic firm or economist to conduct this analysis. Usually they do this for tourism, or for we want to do a big project, a big housing project or commercial district project. You can extract some multipliers implicitly for those kind of studies, but most departments of economic development will have access to these multipliers already.
Okay, thank you. A question about business interruption insurance. Have you seen businesses use this type of information to determine what level of business interruption insurance they should purchase? And if they do, the question from Chad Kossi said, if they do a financial analysis during their exercise, is that good enough information for them to utilize that? Have you seen any businesses use this for that purpose?
I am not aware, that's a great question. I am not aware of businesses that have done that for the purpose of determining insurance requirements. However, I've only seen governments use this to understand the impacts of business interruption so that they understood how it was going to impact jobs and earnings and the general economic environment. But no, I'm not aware of businesses that have used these tools. However, I can easily imagine, excuse me, let me back up. I am aware of businesses using these tools to estimate their impact on a larger economic environment. For example, communities are used to, they engage in economic development by recruiting businesses to their community. Businesses often will, who are trying to get the best deal out of that jurisdiction, might say, listen, we have this many employees, we do this much business. If we take this and multiply it by the multipliers, this suggests our larger impact on your community beyond our business and our employees, because our employees will spend money and we will spend money, we will buy supplies from local suppliers. So every business that locates to a given region or a given community can convince that community how much more they can impact that community by using this tool.
Thanks. I think that leads into this next question from Elizabeth Yarnell, and it's maybe tie this back to your LAX work. How do you bring economic-wide impacts down to a local business level to inspire mitigation actions? You suggest communicating this to industry-level associations or specific businesses.
I've never run it in that direction. I've never run it from these are the potential impacts economy-wide. This is what it means for you.
Uh-huh.
I can imagine how I can show that business, you know, I would go to that business and say, listen, you are in the oil and gas industry, for example, and our research shows that the oil and gas industries have high multiplier effects throughout the regional economy. So if there were a disaster in the regional economy, you would be impacted, even if you weren't impacted directly. You would be impacted because your suppliers would be impacted, or you would be impacted because your customers would be impacted. And this is the extent to which that is true. So these tools can be used to go from the macro to the micro, if you will, but it would be done so in a way to show how they are linked to that larger environment and why resiliency investments might be useful for them to mitigate against those associated impacts.
Okay. Jane Tehan has asked several questions. I'm going to try to combine them into one. She asked whether you've worked for the Federal Department of Commerce, what state agencies are familiar with disaster impact modeling. And so my guess, mine is, how much awareness of this is there out there, do you think, and how much is it driving budgeting and planning and preparedness decision making, and what's the opportunity there? I mean, should we be focused more on, should FEMA do this more, states do this more, locals do this more? What do you think is the awareness and usage of it?
I don't think there is a great deal of awareness of these methodologies in the emergency management field, whether at FEMA or at departments of emergency management at the state and local levels. We have done this increasingly as we've demonstrated our capabilities to help them understand these implications of disasters. The Department of Commerce, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and at the state and local levels, departments of economic development, they use these tools regularly. What they probably do not do, however, is use these tools for the purpose of estimating impacts of disasters. So what we've done here is sort of bring the two worlds together. In a disaster management environment, show how there are economic impacts from disasters, using tools that the economic development environment uses all the time, but rarely for disaster purposes.
Okay, great. And then I think my final question, I'm going to take some stuff that that Chad Cossey said, and I'm going to try to tweak it a little bit, which is you show the secondary impacts, and it may be something that those industries don't consider. So if they are in an area that's highly reliant upon one industry, say oil or gas industry, or in Florida the tourism industry, and it's easy, you know, you can figure out, you know, say a hurricane hits in the Houston area, you know, oil and gas industry is going to be shut down for a while. But what you may not, the average person may not consider is the impacts on the hotels, the retail sector, restaurants, the service industry that helps support that oil and gas industry. Is there, you know, an opportunity here, do you think, to help educate those types of sectors about the impacts of disasters so that they will plan more accordingly for them?
Absolutely, absolutely. This methodology basically shows how local economies and the industries and businesses within those local economies are tied together, so that it doesn't matter whether you hit directly by a disaster. The disaster strikes your community, you're going to be impacted because of you're being linked from a business standpoint to an industry or business that was impacted directly. So in Houston, as you mentioned, Brian, everyone knows in Houston, if oil and gas is hit, we're all hit. Everybody knows that. In places like D.C., they were very concerned with tourism. And so any kind of effect on any industry in DC would impact tourism. The same thing was true for LAX project. If you shut down flights coming into LAX, you're going to reduce a large number of visitors to one of the major cities in the United States, which creates, excuse me, which creates ripple effects throughout Los Angeles. People beyond cities like Houston, where that is clear, where a dominant industry is present and everybody knows they are tied and reliant upon that industry. In every other community, you can easily, there are opportunities to demonstrate how the effect on any given area with the particular industry in that area could impact them because of their linkage to that particular industry.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dr. Blanchard. We are now at the end of our, we've actually gone over a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up for today. I want to thank Dr. Lloyd Blanchard for being with us today. Thank you for your very generous offer of your time to help educate us on this, and I look forward to seeing more and more of us use this in the future. Thank all of you on the webinar for participating today. As a reminder, there will be a short survey, so when you close, please give us your input on it. We really highly value that and utilize it to help design all of our future webinars. We appreciate your thoughts. When you want to view this again, if you want to go back and review any of this, you can go look at the YouTube channel, NEMA for You. And again, that'll be up in a few days. Thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.